Chapter 21 of Flemington. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nan Dodge. Flemington by Violet Jacob. Chapter 21. Huntly Hill. Calendar rode up Huntly Hill. The rose red of the blossoming briar that decks all Angus with its rubies glowed in the failing sunlight, and the scent of its leaf came in puffs from the wayside ditches. The blurred heads of the meadow-sweet were being turned into clouds of gold as the sun grew lower and the road climbed higher. In front, the trees began to mantle Huntly Hill. He had just begun the ascent at a foot's pace when he heard the whir of the beggar's chariot wheels behind him, then at his side, and he turned in his saddle and looked down on his pursuer's bald crown. Wattie had cast off his bonnet, and the light breeze springing up lifted the fringe of his grizzled hair. "Where awa's Flemington?" he cried as he came up. The other answered by another question. His thoughts had come back to the red-haired prisoner at the top of the hill, and it struck him that the man in the cart might recognize him. "What's your name?" he asked abruptly. "Wattie Caird. You belong to these parts?" He nodded. "Then come on. I have not done with you yet. I'm asking you where's Flemington?" If Calendar had pleased himself, he would have driven Wattie down the hill at the point of the sword. His persistence and his pestilent, unashamed curiosity were so distasteful to him. But he had a second use for him now. He was that uncommon thing, a disciplinarian with tact, and by virtue of the combination in himself, he understood that the troopers in front of him, who had been looking forward eagerly to getting their heads once more under a roof that night, would be disgusted by the orders he was bringing. He had noticed the chanters sticking out from under Wattie's leathern bag, and he thought that a stirring tune or two might ease matters for them. He did not see his way to dispensing with him at present, so he tolerated his company. "Mr. Flemington has a bad wound," he answered. "He has gone to Brechin to have it attended to." "Where did he get it?" "At Culloden Moor." "They didna tell me onything aboot that." "Who tells you anything about Mr. Flemington? What do you know about him?" "Heuch!" exclaimed Wattie with contempt. "It's myself that should tell them. I ken mair aboot Flemington than any other body. I ken fine what's brocht yon lad there. He's seeking Logie like onybody else, but he kens fine he'll na get him. Aye, does he?" Calendar looked down from his tall horse upon the grotesque figure so close to the ground. He was furious at the creature's assumption of knowledge. "You are a piper?" said he. "The best in Scotland." "Then keep your breath for piping and let other people's business be," he said sternly. "Man, dinna fash. It's King Geordie's business, and syne it's mine. Him and me's billies. Aye, he's awa', is he, Flemington?" Calendar quickened his horse's pace. He was not going to endure this offensive talk, but Wattie urged on his dogs too, and followed hard on his heels. All through the winter, whilst the fortunes of Scotland were deciding themselves in the north, he had been idle but for his piping and singing, and he had had little to do with the higher matters on which he had been engaged in the autumn, whilst the forces of the coming storm were seething south of the Grampians. He had not set eyes on Flemington since their parting by the farm on Rossie Moor, but many a night, lying among his dogs, he had thought of Archie's voice, calling to Logie as he tossed and babbled in his broken dreams. He had long since drawn his conclusion and made up his mind that he admired Archie as a mighty clever fellow, but he was convinced that he was more astute than anybody supposed, and it gave him great delight to think that probably no one but himself had a notion of the part Flemington was playing. Wattie was well aware of his advancement, for his name was in everybody's mouth. He knew that he was on Cumberland's staff, just as Logie was on the staff of the Prince, and he wagged his head as he thought how Archie must have enriched himself at the expense of both Whig and Jacobite. It was his opinion that knowledge being marketable, it was time that somebody else should enrich himself too. He would have given a great deal to know whether Flemington, as a well-known man, had continued his traffic with the other side, and as he went up the hill beside the dark Whig officer, he was turning the question over in his mind. He had kept his suspicions jealously to himself. Whilst Flemington was far away in the north, and all men's eyes were looking across the Grampians, he knew that he could command no attention, and he had cursed because he believed his chance of profit to be lost. Archie had gone out of range, and he could not reach him. Yet he kept his knowledge close like a prudent man, in case the time should come when he might use it. And now Flemington had returned, and he had been sent out to meet him. The way had grown steep, and as Callandar's horse began to stumble, the soldier swung himself off the tired beast and walked beside him, his hand on the mane. Wattie was considering whether he should speak. If his information were believed, it would be specially valuable at this time, when the authorities were agog to catch Logie, and the reward for his services must be considerable if there was any justice in the world. They would never catch Logie, because Flemington was in league with him. Wattie knew what many knew, that the rebel was believed to be somewhere about the great Muir of Pert, now just in front of them, but so far as he could make out, the only person who was aware of how the wind set with Archie was himself. What he had seen at the foot of Huntly Hill had astonished him till he had read its meaning by the light of his own suspicions. Though he had not been close enough to the two men to hear exactly what passed between them when they parted, he had seen them part. He had seen Callandar standing to look after the other as though uncertain how to act, and he had heard Archie's derisive shout. There was no sign of a quarrel between them, yet Callandar's face suggested they had disagreed. There was perplexity in it, and underlying disapproval. He had seen his gesture of astonishment, and the way in which he had sat looking after Flemington at the crossroads, reining back his horse, which would have followed its companion, was eloquent to the beggar. Callandar had not expected the young man to go. Wattie did not know the nature of the orders he had brought, but he knew that they referred to Logie. He understood that those who received them were hastening to meet those who had dispatched them, and would be with them that night, and this proved to him how important it was that the letters should be in the hand of the riders before they advanced farther on their way. He had been directed to wait on the northern side of Huntly Hill, and had been specially charged to deliver them before Callandar crossed it. He told himself that only a fool would fail to guess that they referred to this particular place, but the illuminating part to Wattie was the speech he had heard by the bracken. It was all that was needed to explain the officer's stormy looks. "These are my orders," Callandar had said, "but you know them, for I am informed that they are the duplicate of yours." Archie had disobeyed them, and Wattie was sure that he had gone, because the risk of meeting Logie was too great to be run. Now was the time for him to speak. He had no nicety, but he had shrewdness in plenty. He was sudden and persistent in his address, and divining the obstacles in Callandar's mind, he charged them like a bull. "Flemington'll na let ye get Logie," said he. He made his announcement with so much emphasis that the man walking beside him was impressed in spite of his prejudices. He was annoyed, too. He turned on him angrily. "Once and for all, what do you mean by this infernal talk about Mr. Flemington?" he cried, stopping short. "You will either speak out, or I will take it upon myself to make you. I have 3 men in the wood up yonder who will be very willing to help me. I believe you to be a meddlesome liar, and if I find that I am right, you shall smart for it." But the beggar needed no urging, and he was not in the least afraid of Callandar. "It's no me that swear to speak, it's yourself that swear to listen," said he, with some truth. "Dod, I've tell't ye afore, and I'm telling ye again, Flemington'll no let ye get him. He's dancing wi' George, but he's taken the tune frae Charlie. Heuch, dinna tell me! There's money hae done the same afore, and I'll dae it yet." The officer was standing in the middle of the road, a picture of perplexity. "It's no the oxter of him that gars him gang," said Wattie, breaking into the broad smile of one who is successfully letting the light of reason into another's mind. "It's no his arm. Maybe it gies him a puckly twist whiles, and maybe it doesna, but it's no that gars the like o' him greet. He wouldna come up Huntly Hill wi' you, for he kent he was ower near Logie. It's that, and nae mair." Callandar began to think back. He had not heard one complaint from Archie since the day they rode out of Fort Augustus together, and he remembered his own astonishment at hearing he was in pain from his wound. It seemed only to have become painful in the last couple of hours. "It is easy to make accusations," he said grimly, "but you will have to prove them. What proof have you?" "Is it proofs you're needin'? Fegs, I dinna gang aboot wi' them in my poke. I can tell ye my proofs fine, but maybe you'll no listen." He made as though to drive on. Callandar stepped in front of the dogs and stood in his path. "You will speak out before I take another step," said he. "I will have no shuffling. Come, out with what you know. I will stay here till I get it." End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Flemington. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nan Dodge. Flemington by Violet Jacob. Chapter 22. Huntly Hill. Continued. Callandar sat a little apart from his men on the fringe of the fir wood. On the other side of the clearing on which the party had bivouacked, Wattie formed the centre of a group. It was past sunset, and the troop horses, having been watered and fed, were picketed together. Callandar's own horse snatched at the straggling bramble shoots behind a tree. The officer sat on a log, his chin in his hand, pondering on the amazing story that the beggar had divulged. It was impossible to know what to make of it, but, in spite of himself, he was inclined to believe it. He had questioned and cross-questioned him, but he had been able to form no definite opinion. Wattie had described his meeting with Archie on the day of the taking of the ship. He had told him how he had accompanied him on his way, how he had been forced to ask shelter for him at the farm, how he had lain and listened in the darkness to his feverish wanderings and his appeals to Logie. If the beggar's tale had been true, there seemed to be no doubt that the intelligence officer whose services were so much valued by Cumberland had taken money from the rebels, though it seemed that he had hesitated over the business. His conscience must have smitten him even in his dreams. "I will say nothing, but I will tell you all," he had cried to Logie. "I shall know where you are, but they shall never know." In his delirium he had taken the beggar for the man whose fellow conspirator he was proving himself to be, and when consciousness was fighting to return, and he had sense enough to know that he was not speaking to Logie, it was his companion's promise to deliver a message of reassurance that had given him peace and sleep. "Tell him that he can trust me," he had said. What puzzled Callandar was the same thing that had puzzled Wattie. Why had these two men, linked together by a hidden understanding, fought? Perhaps Flemington had repented of the part he was playing, and had tried to cut himself adrift. "Let me go!" he had exclaimed. It was all past Callandar's comprehension. At one moment he was inclined to look on Wattie as an understudy for the father of lies. At another, he asked himself how he could have had the courage to invent such a calumny, how he dared to choose a man for his victim who had reached the position that Archie had gained. But he realized that, had Wattie been inventing, he would hardly have invented the idea of a fight between Flemington and Captain Logie. That little incongruous touch seemed to Callandar's reasonable mind to support the truth of his companion's tongue. And then there was Flemington's sudden departure. It did not look so strange since he had heard what the beggar had to say. He began to think of his own surprise at finding Archie in pain from a wound which seemed to have troubled him little so far, and to suspect that his reliable wits had been stimulated to find a new use for his injured arm by the sight of Huntly Hill, combined with the news in his pocket. His gorge rose at the thought that he had been riding all these days side by side with a very prince among traitors. His face hardened. His own duty was not plain to him, and that perturbed him so much that his habitual outward self-repression gave way. He could not sit still while he was driven by his perplexities. He sprang up, walking up and down between the trees. Ought he to send a man straight off to Brechin with a summary of the beggar's statement? He could not vouch for the truth of his information, and there was every chance of it being disregarded, and himself marked as the discoverer of a mare's nest. There was scarcely anything more repugnant to Callandar than the thought of himself in this character, and for that reason, if for no other, he inclined to the risk, for he had the overwhelmingly conscientious man's instinct for martyrdom. His mind was made up. He took out his pocket-book and wrote what he had to say in the fewest and shortest words. Then he called the corporal, and to his extreme astonishment ordered him to ride to Brechin. When the man had saddled his horse, he gave him the slip of paper. He had no means of sealing it here in the fir wood, but the messenger was a trusted man, one to whom he would have committed anything with absolute conviction. He was sorry that he had to lose him, for he could not tell how long he might be kept on the edge of the Muir, nor how much country he would have to search with his tiny force, but there was no help for it, and he trusted that the corporal would be sent back to him before the morrow. He was the only person to whom he could give the open letter. When the soldier had mounted, Callandar accompanied him to the confines of the wood, giving him instructions from the map he carried. Wattie sat on the ground beside his cart. His back was against a little raised bank. Where his feet should have been, the yellow dog was stretched asleep. As Callandar and his corporal disappeared among the trees, he began to sing "The Tod" in his rich voice, throwing an atmosphere of dramatic slyness into the words that made his hearers shout with delight at the end of each verse. When he had finished the song, he was barely suffered to take breath before being compelled to begin again. Even the prisoner, who lay resting, still bound, within sight of the soldiers, listened, laughing into his red beard. But suddenly he stopped, rising to his feet. "A lang-legged devil with his hand upon the gate, and aye the goodwife cries to him." Wattie's voice fell, cutting the line short, for a rush of steps was bursting through the trees, was close on them, dulled by the pine needles underfoot, sweeping over the stumps and the naked roots. The beggar stared, clutching at the bank. His three companions sprang up. The wood rang with shots, and one of the soldiers rolled over on his face, gasping as he tried to rise, struggling and snatching at the ground with convulsed fingers. The remaining two ran, one towards the prisoner, and one towards the horses, which were plunging against each other in terror. The latter man dropped midway with a bullet through his head. The swiftness of the undreamed-of misfortune struck panic into Wattie, as he sat alone, helpless, incapable either of flight or of resistance. One of his dogs was caught by the leaden hail and lay fighting its life out a couple of paces from where he was left, a defenceless thing in this sudden storm of death. Two of the remaining three went rushing through the trees, yelping as the stampeding horses added their share to the danger and riot. These had torn up their heel pegs, which, wrenched easily from a resistance made for the most part of moss and pine needles, swung and whipped at the ends of the flying ropes behind the crazy animals as they dashed about. The surviving trooper had contrived to catch his own horse, and was riding for his life towards the road by which they had come from Edzell. The only quiet thing besides the beggar was the yellow cur, who stood at his master's side, stiff and stubborn and ugly, the coarse hair rising on his back. Wattie's panic grew as the drumming of hooves increased and the horses dashed hither and thither. He was more afraid of them than of the ragged enemy that had descended on the wood. The dead troopers lay huddled, one on his face and the other on his side. The wounded dog's last struggles had ceased. Half a dozen men were pursuing the horses with outstretched arms, and Callandar's charger had broken loose with its comrades, and was thundering this way and that, snorting and leaping, with cocked ears and flying mane. The beggar watched them with a horror which his dislike and fear of horses made agonizing. The menace of these irresponsible creatures, mad with excitement and terror, so heavy, so colossal, when seen from his own helpless nearness to the earth, that was shaking under their tread, paralyzed him. His impotence enwrapped him, tragic, horrible, a nightmare woven of death's terrors. He could not escape. There was no shelter from the thrashing hooves, the gleaming iron of the shoes. The cumbrous perspective of the great animals blocked out the sky with its bulk as their rocking bodies went by, plunging, slipping, recovering themselves within the cramped circle of the open space. He knew nothing of what was happening, nor did he see that the prisoner stood, freed from his bonds. He knew James Logie by sight, and he knew Ferrier, but, though both were standing by the red-bearded man, he recognized neither. He had just enough wits left to understand that Callandar's bivouac had been attacked, but he recked of nothing but the thundering horses that were being chased to and fro as the circle of men closed in. He felt sick as it narrowed, and he could only flatten himself, stupefied, against the bank. The last thing he saw was the yellow coat of his dog, as the beast cowered and snapped, keeping his post with desperate tenacity in the din. The bank against which he crouched cut the clearing diagonally, and as the men pressed in nearer around the horses, Callandar's charger broke out of the circle, followed by the two others. A cry from the direction in which they galloped, and the sound of frantic, nearing hooves, told that they had been headed back once more. The bank was high enough to hide Wattie from them as they returned, but he could feel the earth shake with their approach, which rang in his ears like the roar of some dread, implacable fate. He could see nothing now as he lay, half blind with fear, but he was aware that his dog had leaped upon the bank behind him, and he heard the well-known voice, hoarse and brutal with defiant agony, just above his head. All the qualities that have gone to make the dog the outcast of the East seemed to show in the cur's attitude as he raised himself, an insignificant common beast, in the path of the great noble stampeding creatures. It was the curse of his curship that in this moment of his life, when he hurled all that was his in the world, his low-bred body, against the danger that swooped on his master, he should take on no nobility of aspect, nothing to picture forth the heart that smote against his panting ribs. Another moment, and the charger had leaped at the bank, just above the spot where skirling Wattie's grizzled head lay against the sod. The cur sprang up against the overwhelming bulk, the smiting hooves, the whirl of heel ropes, and struck in mid-air by the horse's knee, was sent rolling down the slope. As he fell, there was a thud of dislodged earth, and the charger, startled by the sudden apparition of the prostrate figure below him, slipped on the bank, stumbled, sprang, and, checked by the flying rope, crashed forward, burying the beggar under his weight. James and Ferrier ran forward as the animal struggled to its feet unhurt. It tore past the men who had broken their line as they watched the fall. The three horses made off between the trees, and Logie approached the beggar. He lay, crushed and mangled, as quiet as the dead troopers on the ground. There was no mistaking Wattie's rigid stillness, and as James and Ferrier, with the red-bearded man, approached him, they knew that he would never rise to blow his pipes, nor to fill the air with his voice again. The yellow dog was stretched, panting, a couple of paces from the grotesque body, which had now, for the first time, taken on dignity. As Logie bent to examine him, and would have lifted him, the cur dragged himself up. One of his hind legs was broken, but he crawled, snarling, to the beggar's side, and turned his maimed body to face the men who should dare to lay a hand on Wattie. The drops poured from his hanging tongue, and his eye was alight with a dull flame of pain. He would have torn Logie to bits if he could, as he trailed himself up to shelter the dead man from his touch. He made a great effort to get upon his legs, and his jaws closed within an inch of James's arm. One of the men drew the pistol from his belt. "Aye, shoot the brute," said another. James held up his hand. "The man is dead," said he, looking over his shoulder at his comrades. "And you would be the same if yon dog could reach you," rejoined Ferrier. "Let me shoot him. He will only die lying here." "Let him be. His leg is broken, that is all." The cur made another attempt to get his teeth into Logie, and almost succeeded. Ferrier raised his pistol again, but James thrust it back. "The world needs a few such creatures as that in it," said he. "Lord, Ferrier, what a heart there is in that poor brute!" "Stand away from him, Logie. He is half mad." "We must get away from this place," said James, unheeding, "or that man who has ridden away will bring the whole country about our ears. It has been a narrow escape for you, Gourlay," he said to the released prisoner. "We must leave the old vagabond lying where he is." "There is no burying him with that devil left alive," cried Ferrier. "I promise you I will not venture to touch him." "My poor fellow," said James, turning to the dog, "it is of no use. You cannot save him. God help you for the truest friend that a man ever had." He pulled off his coat and approached him. The men stood round, looking on in amazement as he flung it over the yellow body. The dog yelled as Logie grasped and lifted him, holding him fast in his arms, but his jaws were muffled in the coat, and the pain of the broken limb was weakening his struggles. Ferrier looked on with his hands on his hips. He admired the dog, but did not always understand James. "You are going to hamper yourself with him now?" he exclaimed. "Give me the piper's bonnet," said the other. "There. Push it into the crook of my arm between the poor brute and me. It will make him go the easier. You will need to scatter now. Leave the piper where he is. A few inches of earth will do him no good. Ferrier, I'm going. You and I will have to lie low for a while after this." The cur had grown exhausted and ceased to fight. He shivered and snuffled feebly at the Kilmarnock bonnet, the knob of which made a red spot against the shirt on James's broad breast. Ferrier and Gourlay glanced after him as he went off between the trees, but as they had no time to waste on the sight of his eccentricities, they disappeared in different directions. Dusk was beginning to fall on the wood and on the dead beggar as he lay with his two silent comrades, looking towards the Grampians from the top of Huntly Hill. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Flemington. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nan Dodge. Flemington by Violet Jacob. Chapter 23. The Muir of Pert. Callandar watched his corporal riding away from the confines of the wood. His eyes followed the horse as it disappeared into hollows and threaded its way among lumps of rock. He stood for some time looking out over the landscape, now growing cold with the loss of the sun, his mind full of Flemington. Then he turned back with a sigh to retrace his way. His original intention in bringing Wattie up the hill came back to him, and he remembered that he had yet to discover whether he could identify the red-bearded man. It was at this moment that the fusillade from his halting place burst upon him. He stopped, listening, then ran forward into the wood, the map from which he had been directing the corporal clutched in his hand. He had gone some distance with the soldier, so he only reached the place when the quick disaster was over to hear the hoof-beats of the escaping horses dying out as they galloped down Huntly Hill. The smoke of the firearms hung below the branches like a grey canopy, giving the unreality of a vision to the spectacle before him. He could not see the beggar's body, but the overturned cart was in full view, a ridiculous object with its wooden wheels raised as though in protest to the sky. He looked in vain for a sign of his third man, and at the sight of the uniform upon the two dead figures lying on the ground, he understood that he was alone. Of the 3 private soldiers who had followed him down Glen Esk, there was not one left with him. Archie, the traitor, was gone, and only the red-bearded man remained. He could see him in the group that was watching James Logie as he captured the struggling dog. Callandar ground his teeth. Then he dropped on one knee and contemplated the sight from behind the great circle of roots and earth that a fallen tree had torn from the sod. Of all men living, he was one of the last who might be called a coward, but neither was he one of those hotheads who will plunge, to their own undoing and to that of other people, into needless disaster. He would have gone grimly into the hornet's nest before him, pistol in hand, leaving heaven to take care of the result, had the smallest advantage to his king and country been attainable thereby. His own death or capture would do no more than prevent him from carrying news of what had happened to headquarters, and he decided, with the promptness hidden behind his taciturn demeanour, that his nearest duty was to identify James Logie, if he were present. Callandar's duty was the only thing that he always saw quickly. From his shelter he marked the 2 Jacobite officers, and as he knew Ferrier very well from description, he soon made out the man he wanted. James was changed since the time when he had first come across Archie's path. His clothes were worn and stained, and the life of wandering and concealment that he had led since he parted from the prince had set its mark on him. He had slept in as many strange places of late as had the dead beggar at his feet. Anxious watching and lack of food and rest were levelling the outward man to something more primitive and haggard than the gallant-looking gentleman of the days before Culloden. Yet there remained to him the atmosphere that could never be obliterated, the personality that he could never lose until the earth should lie on him. He was no better clothed than those who surrounded him, but his preeminence was plain. The watcher devoured him with his eyes as he turned from his comrades, carrying the dog. As soon as he was out of sight, the rebels scattered quietly, and Callandar crouched lower, praying fortune to prevent anyone from passing his retreat. None approached him, and he was left with the 3 dead men in possession of the wood. He rose and looked at his silent comrades. It would be useless to follow Logie, because, with so many of his companions dispersing at this moment about the fringes of the Muir of Pert, he could hardly hope to do so unobserved. There would be no chance of getting to close quarters with him, which was Callandar's chief desire, for the mere suspicion of a hostile presence would only make James shift his hiding place before the gathering troops could draw their cordon round him. He abandoned the idea with regret, telling himself that he must make a great effort to get to Brechin and to return with a mounted force in time to take action in the morning. The success of his ambush and his ignorance that he had been watched would keep Logie quiet for the night. He decided to take the only road that he knew, the one by which Flemington had left him. The upper one entangled itself in the Muir and might lead him into some conclave of the enemy. He began to descend in the shadows of the coming darkness that was drawing itself like an insidious net over the spacious land. He had almost reached the road when a moving object not far from him made him stop. A man was hurrying up the hill some little way to his right, treading swiftly along, and though his head was turned from Callandar, and he was not near enough for him to distinguish his features, the sling across his shoulder told him that it was Flemington. Callandar stood still, staring after him. Archie's boldness took away his breath. Here he was, returning on his tracks, and if he kept his direction, he would have to pass within a few hundred yards of the spot on which he knew that the companions he had left would be halted. Callandar had pointed out the place to him as they approached the hill together. Archie took a wider sweep as he neared the wood, and the soldier, standing in the shadow of a rowan tree, whose berries were already beginning to colour for autumn, saw that he was making for the Muir, and knew that the beggar was justified. One thing only could be bringing him back. He had come, as Wattie had predicted, to warn Logie. He had spoken wisdom, that dead vagabond, lying silent for ever among the trees. He had assured him that Flemington would not suffer him to take Logie. He knew him, and he had laughed at the idea of his wounded arm turning him out of his road. "It's no the like o' that gars the like o' him greet," he had said, and he was right. Callandar, watching the definite course of the figure through the dusk, was sure that he was taking the simplest line to a retreat whose exact position he knew. He turned and followed, running from cover to cover, his former errand abandoned. It was strange that, in spite of all, a vague gladness was in his heart, as he thought that Archie was not the soft creature that he had pretended to be. There were generous things in Callandar. Then his generous impulse turned back on him in bitterness, for it occurred to him that Archie had been aware of what lay waiting for them, and had saved himself from possible accident in time. They went on till they reached the border of the Muir, Flemington going as unconcernedly as if he were walking in the streets of Brecon, though he kept wide of the spot on which he believed the riders to have disposed themselves for the night. There was no one who knew him in that part of the country, and he wore no uniform to make him conspicuous in the eyes of any chance passer in this lonely neighbourhood. As Callandar emerged from the straggling growth at the Muir's edge, he saw him still in front going through the deep thickness of the heather. Callandar wished that he knew how far the Muir extended and exactly what lay on its farther side. His map was thrust into his coat, but it was now far too dark for him to make use of it. The tall figure was only just visible, and he redoubled his pace, gaining a little on it. A small stationary light shone ahead, evidently the window of some muirland hovel. There was nothing so difficult to decide as the distance of a light at night, but he guessed that it was the goal towards which Archie was leading. He went forward till the young man's voice hailing someone and the sound of knocking made him stop and throw himself down in the heather. He thought he heard a door shut. When all had been quiet for a minute, he rose up, and approaching the house, took up his stand not a dozen yards from the walls. Perplexity came on him. He had been surprisingly successful in pursuing Flemington unnoticed as far as this hovel, but he had yet to find out who was inside it. Perhaps the person he had heard speaking was Logie, but equally perhaps not. There was no sound of voices within, though he heard movements. He dared not approach the uncurtained window to look in, for the person whose step he heard was evidently standing close to it. He would wait, listening for that person to move away, and then would try his luck. He had spent perhaps 10 minutes thus occupied, when, without a warning sound, the door opened, and Archie stood on the threshold, as still as though he were made of marble. It was too dark for either man to see more than the other's blurred outline. Flemington looked out into the night. "Come in, Callandar," he called. "You are the very man I want." The soldier's astonishment was such that his feet seemed frozen to the ground. He did not stir. "Come," cried Archie. "You have followed me so far that you surely will not turn back at the last step. I need you urgently, man. Come in." He held the door open. Callandar entered, pushing past him, and found himself in a low, small room, wretchedly furnished, with another at the back opening out of it. Both were empty, and the light he had seen was standing on the table. "There is no one here," he exclaimed. "No," said Flemington. "Where is the man you were speaking to?" "He is gone. The ill-mannered rogue would not wait to receive you." "It was that rebel! It was Captain Logie!" cried Callandar. "It was not Logie, you may take my word for that," replied Archie. He sat down on the edge of the table and crossed his legs. "Try again, Callandar," he said lightly. Callandar's lips were drawn into an even line, but they were shaking. The mortification of finding that Archie had been aware of his presence, had pursued his way unconcerned, knowing that he followed, had called him in as a man calls the serving man he has left outside, was hot in him. No wonder his own concealment had seemed so easy. "You have sent him to warn Logie, that is what you have done!" he cried. "You are a scoundrel! I know that!" He stepped up to him and would have laid hold of his collar, but the sling stopped him. "I have. Callandar, you are a genius." As the other stood before him, speechless, Flemington rose up. "You have got to arrest me," he said. "That is why I called you in. I might have run out by the back of the house, like the man who is gone, who went with my message almost before the door was shut. Look, I have only one serviceable arm and no sword. I left it where I left my horse. And here is my pistol. I will lay it on the table, so you will have no trouble in taking me prisoner. You have not had your stalking for nothing, after all, you mighty hunter before the Lord." "You mean to give yourself up? You who have taken so much care to save yourself?" "I have meant to ever since I saw you under the rowan tree, watching me, flattened against the trunk like a squirrel. I would as soon be your prisoner as anyone else's. Sooner, I think." "I cannot understand you," exclaimed Callandar, taking possession of the weapon Archie had laid down. "It is hard enough to understand oneself, but I do at last," said the other. "Once I thought life easy, but mine has been mighty difficult lately. From here on it will be quite simple, and there will not be much more of it, I fancy." "You are right there," said Callandar grimly. "I can see straight before me now. I tell you, life has grown simple." "You lied at the crossroads." "I did. How you looked after me as I went! Well, I have done what I suppose no one has ever done before. I have threatened to report you for neglecting your duty." He threw back his head and laughed. "And I am obliged to tell you to arrest me now. Oh, Callandar, who will correct your backslidings when there is an end of me?" The other did not smile as he looked at Flemington's laughing eyes, soft and sparkling under the downward curve of his brows. Through his anger, the pity of it all was smiting him, though he was so little given to sentiment. Perhaps Archie's charm had told on him all the time they had been together, though he had never decided whether he liked him or not, and he looked so young when he laughed. "What have you done?" he cried, pacing suddenly up and down the little room. "You have run on destruction, Flemington. You have thrown your life away. Why have you done this? You! If a thing is worthless, there is nothing to do but throw it away." Callandar watched him with pain in his eyes. "What made you suspect me?" asked Archie. "You can tell me anything now. There is only one end to this business. It will be the making of you." "Pshaw!" exclaimed the other, turning away. "Why did you follow me?" continued Archie. Callandar was silent. "Tell me this," he said at last. "What makes you give yourself up now without a struggle or a protest, when little more than 2 hours ago you ran from what you knew was to come, there at the foot of the hill? Surely your friends would have spared you." "Now it is I who do not understand you," said Archie. His companion stood in front of him, searching his face. "Flemington, are you lying? On your soul, are you lying?" "Of what use are lies to me now?" exclaimed Archie impatiently. "Truth is a great luxury. Believe me, I enjoy it." "You knew nothing of what was waiting for us at the top of Huntly Hill?" "Nothing, as I live," said Archie. "The beggar betrayed you," said Callandar. "When you were gone, he told me that you were in Logie's pay, that you would warn him. He was right, Flemington." "I am not in Logie's pay. I never was," broke in Archie. "I did not know what to think," the soldier went on, "but I took him up Huntly Hill with me, and when we had unsaddled and the men were lying under the trees, I sent the corporal to Brechin with the information. I went with him to the edge of the wood, and when I came back there was not a man left alive. Logie and Ferrier were there with a horde of their rebels. They had come to rescue the prisoner, and he was loose." "And he was Ferrier's cousin!" exclaimed Flemington. "We were right." "One of my men escaped," continued Callandar, "or I suppose so, for he was gone. The beggar and the other two were killed, and the horses had stampeded." "So Wattie is dead," mused Flemington. "Gad, what a voice has gone with him!" "They did not see me, but I watched them. I saw him, Logie. He went off quickly, and he took one of the beggar's dogs with him, snarling and struggling, with his head smothered in his coat. Then I went down the hill, meaning to make for Brechin, and I saw you coming back. I knew what you were about, thanks to that beggar." Neither spoke for a moment. Archie was still sitting on the table. He had been looking on the ground, and he raised his eyes to his companion's face. Something stirred in him, perhaps at the thought of how he stood with fate. He was not given to thinking about himself, but he might well do so now. "Callandar," he said, "I dare say you don't like me." Then he broke off, laughing. "How absurd!" he exclaimed. "Of course you hate me. It is only right you should. Perhaps you will understand. I think you will, if you will listen. I was thrown against Logie, no matter how, but, unknowing what he did, he put his safety in my hands. He did more. I had played upon his sympathy, and in the generosity of his heart he came to my help, as one true man might do to another. I was not a true man, but he did not know that. He knew nothing of me but that I stood in need, and he believed I was as honest as himself. He thought I was with his own cause. That was what I wished him to believe, had almost told him." Callandar listened, the lines of his long face set. "I had watched him and hunted him," continued Archie, "and my information against him was already in the beggar's hands, on its way to its mark. I could not bring myself to do more against him then. What I did afterwards was done without mention of his name. You see, Callandar, I have been true to nobody." He paused, waiting for comment, but the other made none. "After that I went to Edinburgh," he continued, "and he joined the Prince. Then I went north with Cumberland. I was freed from my difficulty until they sent me here to take him. The Duke gave me my orders himself, and I had to go. That ride with you was hell, Callandar, and when we met the beggar today I had to make my choice. That was the turning point for me. I could not go on." "He said it was not your wound that turned you aside." "He was a shrewd rascal," said Flemington. "I wish I could tell how he knew so much about me." "It was your own tongue. Once you spent the night in a barn together when you were light-headed from a blow, and you spoke all night of Logie. You said enough to put him on your track. That is what he told me as we went up Huntly Hill." Archie shrugged his shoulders and rose up. "Now what are you going to do?" he said. "I'm going to take you to Brechin." "Come then," said Archie. "We shall finish our journey together after all. It has been a hard day. I am glad it is over." They went out together. As Callandar drew the door to behind them, Archie stood still. "If I have dealt double with Logie, I will not do so with the King," said he. "This is the way out of my difficulty. Do you understand me, Callandar?" The darkness hid the soldier's face. Perhaps of all the people who had played their part in the tangle of destiny, character, circumstance, or whatsoever influences had brought Flemington to the point at which he stood, he was the one who understood him best. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Flemington. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nan Dodge. Flemington by Violet Jacob. Chapter 24. The Vanity of Men. The last months had been a time of great anxiety to Lord Balnillo. In spite of his fine steering, and though he had escaped from molestation, he was not comfortable as he saw the imprisonments and confiscations that were going on, and the precariousness of all that had been secure disturbed him and made him restless. He was unsettled, too, by his long stay in Edinburgh, and he hankered afresh after the town life in which he had spent so many of his years. His trees and parks interested him still, but he looked on them, wondering how long he would be allowed to keep them. He was lonely, and he missed James, whom he had not seen since long before Culloden, the star of whose destiny had led him out again into the world of chance. He had the most upsetting scheme under consideration that a man of his age can entertain. At 64, it is few people who think seriously of changing their state. Yet this was what David Balnillo had in mind, for he had found so many good reasons for offering his hand to Christian Flemington that he had decided at last to take that portentous step. The greatest of these was the effect that an alliance with the Whig lady would produce in the quarters, from which he feared trouble. His estate would be pretty safe if Madam Flemington reigned over it. It was pleasant to picture her magnificent presence at his table. Her company would rid country life of its dullness, and on the visits to Edinburgh, which he was sure she would wish to make, the new Lady Balnillo would turn their lodging into a bright spot in society. He smoothed his silk stockings as he imagined the stir that his belated romance would make. He would be the hero of it, and its heroine, besides being a safeguard to his property, would be a credit to himself. There were some obstacles to his plan, and one of them was Archie, but he believed that with a little diplomacy that particular difficulty might be overcome. He would attack that side of the business in a very straightforward manner. He would make Madam Flemington understand that he was large-minded enough to look upon the episode in which he had borne the part of victim in a reasonable yet airy spirit. In the game in which their political differences had brought them face to face, the honours had been with the young man. He would admit that with a smile, and with the respect that one noble enemy accords to another. He would assure her that bygones should be bygones, and that when he claimed Archie as his grandson-in-law, he would do so without one grudging backward glance at the circumstances in which they had first met. His magnanimity seemed to him an almost touching thing, and he played with the idea of his own apposite grace when, in some sly but genial moment, he would suggest that the portrait upstairs should be finished. What had given the final touch to his determination was a message that James had contrived to send him, which removed the last scruple from his heart. His brother's danger had weighed upon David, and it was not only its convenience to himself at this juncture which made him receive it with relief. Logie was leaving the country for Holland, and the next tidings of him would come from there, should he be lucky enough to reach its shores alive. Since the rescue of Gourlay, the neighbourhood of the Muir of Pert, the last of his haunts in which Logie could trust himself, had become impossible for him, and he was now striving to get to a creek on the coast below Peterhead. It was some time since a roof had been over him, and the little cottage from which Flemington had despatched his urgent warning stood empty. Its inmate had been his unsuspected connection with the world since his time of wandering had begun, for though his fatal mistake in discovering this link in his chain of communication to Flemington had made him abjure its shelter, he had had no choice for some time between the Muir and any other place. The western end of the county swarmed with troops. Montrose was subdued. The passes of the Grampians were watched. There remained only this barren tract west of the river, and the warning brought to him from a nameless source had implored him to abandon it before the soldiery, which his informant assured him was collecting to sweep it from end to end, should range itself on its borders. Archie had withheld his name when he sent the dweller in the little hovel speeding into the night. He was certain that in making it known to James he would defeat his own ends, for Logie would scarcely be disposed to trust his good faith, and might well look on the message as a trick to drive him into some trap waiting for him between the Muir and the sea. James did not give his brother any details of his projected flight. He merely bade him an indefinite goodbye. The game was up, even he was obliged to admit that, and Ferrier, whose ardent spirit had been one with his own since the beginning of all things, was already making for a fishing village, from which he hoped to be smuggled out upon the high seas. Nothing further could be gained in Angus for the Stuart cause. The Friends had spent themselves since April in their endeavours to resuscitate the feeling in the country, but there was no more money to be raised, no more men to be collected. They told themselves that all they could do now was to wait in the hope of a day when their services might be needed again. That day would find them both ready, if they were above ground. David knew that, had James been in Scotland, he would not have dared to think of bringing Christian Flemington to Balnillo. He had a feeling of adventure when he started from his own door for Ardguys. The slight awe with which Christian still inspired him, even when she was most gracious, was beginning to foreshadow itself, and he knew that his bones would be mighty stiff on the morrow. There was no riding of the circuit now to keep him in practice in the saddle, but he was not going to give way to silly apprehensions unsuited to his age and position. He would give himself every chance in the way of effect. The servant who rode after him carried a handsome riding suit for his master to don at Forfar before making the last stage of his road. It grieved Balnillo to think how much of the elegance of his well-turned legs must be unrevealed by his high boots. He was a personable old gentleman, and his grey cob was worthy of carrying an eligible wooer. He reached Ardguys and dismounted under its walls on the following afternoon. He had sent no word in front of him. Christian rose when he was ushered into her presence and laid down the book in her hand, surprised. "You are as unexpected as an earthquake," she exclaimed, as she saw who was her visitor. "But not as unwelcome," said David. "Far from it. Sit down, my lord. I had begun to forget that civilization existed, and now I am reminded of it." He bowed, delighted. A few messages and compliments, a letter or two dispatched by hand, had been their only communications since the judge left Edinburgh, and his spirits rose as he found that she seemed really pleased to see him. "And what has brought you?" asked Christian, settling herself with the luxurious deliberation of a cat into the large chair from which she had risen. "Something good, certainly." "A simple desire to see you, ma'am. Could anything be better?" It was an excellent opening, but he had never, even in his youth, been a man who ran full tilt upon anything. He had scarcely ever before made so direct a speech. She smiled, amused. There had been plenty of time for thought in her solitude, but though she had thought a good deal about him, she had not a suspicion of his errand. She saw people purely in relation to the uses she had for them, and officially she had pronounced him harmless to the party in whose interest she had kept him at her side. The circumstances were not those which further sentiment. "I have spent this quiet time in remembering your kindnesses to me," he began, inspired by her smile. "You call it a quiet time?" she interrupted. "I had not looked on it in that way. Quiet for us, perhaps, but not for the country." "True, true," said he, in the faraway tone in which some people seek to let unprofitable subjects melt. Now that the active part of the rebellion had become history, she had no hesitation in speaking out from her solid place on the winning side. "This wretched struggle is over, and we may be plain with one another, Lord Balnillo," she continued. "You, at least, have had much to alarm you." "I have been a peaceful servant of law and order all my life," said he, "and as such I have conceived it my place to stand aloof. It has been my duty to restrain violence of all kinds." "But you have not restrained your belongings," she observed boldly. He was so much taken aback that he said nothing. "Well, my lord, it is one of my regrets that I have never seen Captain Logie. At least you have to be proud of a gallant man," she went on, with the same impulse that makes all humanity set a fallen child upon its legs. But Balnillo had a genius for scrambling to his feet. "My brother has left the country in safety," he rejoined, with one of those random flashes of sharpness that had stood him in such good stead. His cunning was his guardian angel, for he did not know what she knew, namely, that Archie had left Fort Augustus in pursuit of James. "Indeed," she said, silenced. She was terribly disappointed, but she hid her feelings in barefaced composure. The judge drew his chair closer. Here was another opening, and his very nervousness pushed him towards it. "Ma'am," he began, clearing his throat, "I shall not despair of presenting James to you when the country is settled, if, in short, I imagine that Captain Logie will hardly trust himself in Scotland, either in my lifetime or in yours. We are old, you and I," she added, the bitterness of her disappointment surging through her words. She watched him to see whether this barbed truth pierced him. It pierced herself as she hurled it. "Maybe," said he, "but age has not kept me from the business I have come upon. I have come to put a very particular matter before you." She was still unsuspicious, but she grew impatient. He had wearied her often in Edinburgh with tedious histories of himself, and she had endured them then for reasons of policy, but she felt no need of doing so here. It was borne in upon her, as it has been borne in upon many of us, that a person who is acceptable in town may be unendurable in the country. She had not thought of that as she welcomed him. "Ma'am," he went on, intent on nothing but his affair, "I may surprise you. I trust I shall not offend you. At least you will approve the feelings of devotion, of respect, of admiration which have brought me here. I have an ancient name. I have sufficient means. I am not ill-looking, I believe." "Are you making me a proposal, my lord?" She spoke with an accent of derision. The sting of it was sharp in her tone. "There is no place for ridicule, ma'am. I see nothing unsuitable in my great regard for you." He spoke with real dignity. She had not suspected him of having any, personally, and she had forgotten that an inherited stock of it was behind him. The rebuke astonished her so much that she scarcely knew what reply to make. "As I said, I believe I am not ill-looking," he repeated, with an air that lost him his advantage. "I can offer you such a position as you have a right to expect." "You also offer me a brother-in-law whose destination may be the scaffold," she said brutally. "Do not forget that." This was not to be denied, and for a moment he was put out. But it was on these occasions that he shone. "Let us dismiss family matters from our minds and think only of ourselves," said he. "My brother is an outlaw, and as such is unacceptable to you, and your grandson has every reason to be ashamed to meet me. We can set these disadvantages one against the other and agree to ignore them." "I am not disposed to ignore Archie," said she. "Well, ma'am, neither am I. I hope I am a large-minded man. Indeed, no one can sit on the bench for the time that I have sat on it and not realize the frailty of all creatures." "My lord," began Christian. But it is something to have learned continuance of speech professionally, and Balnillo was launched. Also, his own magnanimous attitude had taken his fancy. "I will remember nothing against him," said he. "I will forget his treatment of my hospitality and the discreditable uses to which he put my roof." "Sir," broke in Christian. I will remember that, according to his lights, he was in the exercise of his duty. Whatsoever may be my opinion of the profession to which he was compelled, I will thrust it behind me with the things best forgotten." "That is enough, Lord Balnillo," cried Madam Flemington, rising. "Sit, madam, sit. Do not disturb yourself. Understand me that I will allow every leniency. I will make every excuse. I will dwell not on the fact that he was a spy, but on his enviable relationship to yourself." She stood in the middle of the room, threatening him with her eyes. Some people tremble when roused to the pitch of anger that she had reached. Some gesticulate. Christian was still. He had risen too. "If you suppose that I could connect myself with a disloyal house, you are much mistaken," she said, controlling herself with an effort. "I have no quarrel with your name, Lord Balnillo. It is old enough. My quarrel is with the treason in which it has been dipped. But I am very well content with my own. Since I have borne it, I have kept it clean from any taint of rebellion." "But I have been a peaceful man," he protested. "As I told you, the law has been my profession. I have raised a hand against no one." "Do you think I do not know you?" exclaimed she. "Do you suppose that my ears were shut in the winter, and that I heard nothing in all the months I spent in Edinburgh? What of that, Lord Balnillo?" "You made no objection to me then, ma'am. I was made happy by being of service to you." She laughed scornfully. "Let us be done with this," she said. "You have offered yourself to me, and I refuse the offer. I will add my thanks." The last words were a masterpiece of insolent civility. A gilt-framed glass hung on the wall, one of the possessions that she had brought with her from France. David suddenly caught sight of his own head reflected in it above the lace cravat for which he had paid so much. The spectacle gathered up his recollections and his present mortification and fused them into one stab of hurt vanity. "I see that you can make no further use of me," he said. "None." He walked out of the room. At the door he turned and bowed. "If you will allow me, I will call for my horse myself," said he. He went out of the house, and she stood where she was, thinking of what he had told her about his brother. She had set her heart upon Archie's success in taking Logie, and now the man had left the country, and his chance was gone. The proposal to which she had just listened did not matter to her one way or the other, though he had offended her by the attitude he took up when making it. He was unimportant. It was of Archie that she thought, as she watched the judge and his servant ride away between the ash trees. They were crossing the Kilpie burn when her maid came in, bringing a letter. The writing on it was strange to Christian. "Who has brought this?" she asked as she opened it. "Just a callant," replied the girl. She read the letter, which was short. It was signed R. Calendar, Captain, and was written at Archie Flemington's request to tell her that he was under arrest at Brechin on a charge of conspiring with the king's enemies. The writer added a sentence, unknown, as he explained to Flemington. "The matter is serious," he wrote. "The Duke of Cumberland is still in Edinburgh. It might be well if you could see him. Make no delay, as we await his orders." She stood, turning cold, her eyes fixed on the maid. "Ah, losh, mem," whimpered Mysie, approaching her with her hands raised. Madam Flemington felt as though her brain refused to work. There seemed to be nothing to drive it forward. The world stood still. The walls, an imprisoning horror, shut her in from all movement, all action, when action was needed. She had never felt Ardguys to be so desperately far from the reach of humanity, herself so much cut off from it, as now. And yet she must act. Her nearest channel of communication was the judge, riding away. "Fool!" she cried, seizing Mysie. "Run! Run! Send the boy after Lord Balnillo! Tell him to run!" The maid hesitated, staring at the pallor of her mistress's face. "Ah, but mem, sit you down!" she wailed. Christian thrust her from her path as though she had been a piece of furniture, and swept into the hall. A barefooted youth was outside by the door. He stared at her, as Mysie had done. She took him by the shoulder. "Run! Go instantly after those horses! That is Lord Balnillo," she cried, pointing to the riders, who were mounting the rise beyond the burn. "Tell him to return at once. Tell him he must come back." He shook off her grip and ran. He was a corner boy from Brecon, and he had a taste for sensation. Madam Flemington went back into her room. Mysie followed her, whimpering still, and she pushed her outside and sank down in her large chair. She could not watch the window for fear of going mad. She sat still and steady until she heard the thud of bare feet on the stone steps, and then she hurried out. "He tell't me he wouldna bide," said the corner boy breathlessly. "He was verra well obliged to ye, but he bade me say, but he wadna bide." Christian left him and shut herself into the room alone. Callandar's bald lines had overpowered her completely, leaving no place in her brain for anything else. But now she saw her message from Lord Balnillo's point of view, and anger and contempt flamed up again, even in the midst of her trouble. "The vanity of men! Ah, God, the vanity of men!" she cried, throwing out her hands, as though to put the whole race of them from her. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Flemington. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nan Dodge. Flemington by Violet Jacob. Chapter 25. A Royal Duke. The Duke of Cumberland was at Holyrood House. He had come down from the north by way of Stirling, and having spent some days in Edinburgh, he was making his final arrangements to set out for England. He was returning in the enviable character of conquering hero, and he knew that a great reception awaited him in London, where every preparation was being made to do him honour. He was thinking of these things as he sat in one of the grim rooms of the ancient palace. There was not much luxury here, and looking across the table at which he sat, and out of the window, he could see the dirty roofs of the Canongate, a very different prospect from the one that would soon meet his eyes. He was sick of Scotland. Papers were littered on the table, and his secretary had just carried away a bundle with him. He was alone because he expected a lady to whom he had promised an audience, but he was not awaiting her with the feelings that he generally brought to such occasions. Cumberland had received the visits of many women alone since leaving England, but his guests were younger than the one whose approach he could now hear in the anteroom outside. He drew his brows together, for he expected no profit and some annoyance from the interview. He arose as she was ushered in and went to the open fireplace, where he stood awaiting her, drawn up to his full height, which was not great. The huge iron dogs behind him and the high mantelpiece above his head dwarfed him with their large lines. He was not an ill-looking young man, though his hair, pulled back and tied after the fashion of the day, showed off the receding contours that fell away from his temples, and made his blue eyes look more prominent than they were. He moved forward clumsily as Christian curtsied. "Come in, madam, come in. Be seated. I have a few minutes only to give you," he said, pointing to a chair on the farther side of the table. She sat down opposite to him. "I had the honour of being presented to your Royal Highness last year," she said. "I remember you well, ma'am," replied he shortly. "It is in the hope of being remembered that I have come," said she. "It is to ask you, sir, to remember the services of my house to yours." "I remember them, ma'am. I forget nothing." "I'm asking you, in remembering, to forget one thing," said she. "I shall not waste your Royal Highness's time and mine in beating about bushes. I have travelled here from my home without resting, and it is not for me to delay now." He took up a pen that lay beside him and put the quill between his teeth. "Your Royal Highness knows why I have come," continued she, her eyes falling from his own, and fixing themselves on the pen in his mouth. He removed it with his fat hand and tossed it aside. "There is absolute proof against Flemington," said he. "He accuses himself. I presume you know that." "I do. This man, Captain Logie, has some strange attraction for him that I cannot understand, and did him some kindness that seems to have turned his head. His regard for him was a purely personal one. It was personal friendship that led him to the madness he has wrought. His hands are clean of conspiracy. I have come all this way to assure your Highness of that." "It is possible," said Cumberland. "The result is the same. We have lost the man whose existence above ground is a danger to the kingdom. I have come to ask you to take that difference of motive into consideration," she went on. "Were the faintest shadow of conspiracy proved, I should not dare to approach you. My request should not pass my lips. I have been in correspondence with him during the whole of the campaign, and I know that he served the king loyally. I beg your Highness to remember that now. I speak of his motive because I know it." "You are fortunate, then," he interrupted. "Captain Callandar, to whom he gave himself up, wrote me 2 letters at his request, one in which he announced his arrest, and one which I received as I entered my coach to leave my door. Archie knows what is before him," she added. "He has no hope of life and no knowledge of my action in coming to your Highness. But he wished me to know the truth, that he had conspired with no one. He is ready to suffer for what he has done, but he will not have me ashamed of him. Look, sir." She pushed the letter over to him. "His motives may go hang, madam," said Cumberland. "Your Highness, if you have any regard for us who have served you, read this." He rose and went back to the fireplace. "There is no need, madam. I am not interested in the correspondence of others." He was becoming impatient. He had spent enough time on this lady. She was not young enough to give him any desire to detain her. She was an uncommon-looking woman, certainly, but at her age that fact could matter to nobody. He wondered casually whether the old stories about her and Charles Edward's father were true. Women struck him only in one light. "You will not read this, your Royal Highness?" said Christian, with a little tremor of voice. "No, ma'am. I may tell you that my decision has not altered. The case is not one that admits of any question." "Your Highness," said Christian, rising, "I have never made an abject appeal to anyone yet, and even now, though I make it to the son of my king, I can hardly bring myself to utter it. I deplore my boy's action from the bottom of my soul. I sent him from me. I parted from him nearly a year ago because of this man Logie." He faced round upon her and put his hands behind his back. "What!" he exclaimed. "You knew of this? You have been keeping this affair secret between you?" "He went to Montrose on the track of Logie in November," said she. "He was sent there to watch his movements before Prince Charles marched to England, and he did so well that he contrived to settle himself under Lord Balnillo's roof. In 3 days he returned to me. He had reported on Logie's movements. I know that. Your Highness's agents can produce his report. But he returned to my house to tell me that, for some fool's reason, some private question of sentiment, he would follow Logie no longer. 'I will not go man-hunting after Logie,' those were his words." "Madam," began Cumberland. She put out her hand, and her gesture seemed to reverse their positions. "I told him to go. I told him that I would sooner see him dead than that he should side with the Stuarts. He answered me that he could have no part with rebels, and that his act concerned Logie alone. Then he left me, and on his way to Brechin he received orders to go to the government ship in Montrose harbour. Then the ship was attacked and taken." "It was Flemington's friend Logie who was at the bottom of that business," said Cumberland. "He met Logie and they fought," said Madam Flemington. "I know none of the details, but I know that they fought. Then he went to Edinburgh." "It is time that we finished with this," exclaimed Cumberland. "No good is served by it." "I am near the end, your Highness," said Christian, and then paused, unnerved by the too great suggestiveness of her words. "These things are no concern of mine," he observed in the pause. "His movements do not matter. and I may tell you, ma'am, that my leisure is not unlimited." It was nearing the close of the afternoon, and the sun stood like a red ball over the mists of the Edinburgh smoke. Cumberland's business was over for the day, and he was looking forward to dining that evening with a carefully chosen handful of friends, male and female. Her nerve was giving way against the stubborn detachment of the man. She felt herself helpless, and her force ineffective. Life was breaking up round her. The last man she had confronted had spurned her in the end, through a mistake, it was true, but the opportunity had been given him by her own loss of grip in the bewilderment of a crisis. This one was spurning her too, but she went on. "He performed his work faithfully from that day forward, as your Royal Highness knew when you took him to the north. His services are better known to you, sir, than to anyone else. He gave himself up to Captain Callandar as the last proof that he could take no part with the rebels. He threw away his life." "That, at least, is true," said the Duke, with a sneer. He was becoming exasperated, and the emphasis which she put on the word "that" brought the slow blood to her face. She looked at him as though she saw him across some mud-befouled stream. Even now her pride rose above the despair in her heart. He was not sensitive, but her expression stung him. "I am accustomed to truth," she replied. He turned his back. There was a silence. "I came to ask for Archie's life," she said in a toneless, steady voice, "but I will go, asking nothing. Your Royal Highness has nothing to give that he or I would stoop to take at your hands." He stood doggedly without turning, and he did not move until the sound of her sweeping skirts had died away in the anteroom. Then he went out, a short, stoutish figure passing along the dusty corridors of Holyrood, and entered a room from which came the ring of men's voices. A party of officers in uniform got up as he came in. Some were playing cards. He went up to one of the players and took those he held from between his fingers. "Give me your hand, Walden," said he, "and for God's sake get us a bottle of wine. Damn me, but I hate old women. They should have their tongues cut out." End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Flemington. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nan Dodge. Flemington by Violet Jacob. Chapter 26. The Vanishing Bird. The houses of Brecon climbed from the river up the slope, and a little camp was spread upon the crest of ground above them, looking down over the uneven patterns of walls, the rising smoke, and the woods that cradled the Esk. Such of Cumberland's soldiery as had collected in Angus was drawn together here, and as the country was settling down, the camp was increased by detachments of horse and foot that arrived daily from various directions. The Muir of Pert was bare, left to the company of the roe deer and the birds, for James had been traced to the coast, and the hungry North Sea had swallowed his tracks. The spot occupied by the tents of Callandar's troop was in the highest corner of the camp, the one farthest from the town, and the long northern light that lingered over the hill enveloped the camp sounds and sights in a still greenish clearness. There would be a bare few hours of darkness. Callandar was now in command of a small force consisting of a troop of his own regiment, which had lately marched in, and two of his men stood sentry outside the tent in which Archie Flemington was sitting at an improvised table, writing a letter. He had been a close prisoner since his arrest on the Muir of Pert, and during the week that had elapsed, whilst correspondence about him and orders concerning him had gone to and fro between Brecon and Edinburgh, he had been exclusively under Callandar's charge. That arrangement was the one concession made on his behalf, among the many that had been asked for by his friends. At his own request, he was to remain Callandar's prisoner till the end, and it was to be Callandar's voice that would give the order for his release at sunrise tomorrow. and Callandar's troopers whose hands would set him free. The two men had spent much time together. Though the officer's responsibility did not include the necessity of seeing much of his prisoner, he had chosen to spend nearly all his leisure in Archie's tent. They had drawn very near together, this incongruous pair, though the chasm that lay between their respective temperaments had not been bridged by words. They had sat together on many evenings, almost in silence, playing cards until one of them grew drowsy, or some officious cock crowed on the outskirts of the town. Of the incident which had brought them into their present relationship they spoke not at all, but sometimes Archie had broken out into snatches of talk, and Callandar had listened, with his grim smile playing about his mouth, to his descriptions of the men and things amongst which his short life had thrown him. As he looked across at his companion, who sat, his eyes sparkling in the light of the lantern, his expression changing with the shades of humour that ran over his words, like shadows over growing corn, he would be brought up short against the thought of the terrible incongruity to come: death. He could not think of Archie and death. At times he would have given a great deal to pass on his responsibility to some other man, and to turn his back on the place that was to witness such a tragedy. In furthering Archie's wishes by his own application for custody of him, he had given him a great proof of friendship. How great he was only to learn as the days went by. Would to God it were over, so he would say to himself each night as he left the tent. He had thought Archie soft when they parted at the crossroads, and he had been sorry. There was no need for sorrow on that score, never had been. The sorrow to him now was that so gallant, so brilliant a creature was to be cut off from the life of the world, to go down into the darkness, leaving so many of its inhabitants, half-hearted, half-spirited, half alive, to crawl on in an existence which only interested them inasmuch as it supplied their common needs. His hostility against Logie ran above the level of the just antagonism that a man feels for his country's enemy, and he questioned whether his life were worth the price that Flemington was paying for it. The hurried words that Archie had spoken about Logie as they left the hovel together had told him little, and that little seemed to him inadequate to explain the tremendous consequences that had followed. What had Logie said or done that had power to turn him out of his way? A man may meet many admirable characters among his enemies without having his efforts paralysed by the encounter. Flemington was not new to his trade, and had been long enough in the Secret Service to know its requirements. A certain unscrupulousness was necessarily among them, yet why had his gorge only risen against it now? Callandar could find no signs in him of the overwrought sensibility that seemed to have prompted his revolt against his task. Logie had placed his safety in Archie's hands, and it was in order to end that safety that the young man had gone out. He had laid the trap, and the quarry had fallen into it. What else had he expected? It was not that Callandar could not understand the scruple. What he could not understand was why a man of Archie's occupation should suddenly be undone by it. Having accepted his task, his duty had been plain. In theory, a rebel to Callandar was a rebel, no more, and Archie, by his deed, had played a rebel's part. Yet, in spite of that, the duty he must carry out on the morrow was making his heart sink within him. One thing about Archie stood out plain. He was not going to shirk his duty to his king, and yet take government money. Whatsoever his doings, the prisoner who sat in the tent over yonder would be lying under the earth tomorrow, because he was prepared to pay the last price for his scruple. No, he was not soft. Callandar would have died sooner than let him escape, yet his escape would have made him glad. Callandar came across the camp and passed between the two sentries into Flemington's tent. The young man looked up from his writing. "You are busy," said the officer. "I have nearly done. There seems so much to do at the last," he added. The other sat down on the bed and looked at him, filled with grief. The lantern stood by Archie's hand. His head was bent into the circle of light, and the yellow shine that fell upon it warmed his olive skin and brought out the brown shades in his brows and hair. The changing curves of his mouth were firm in the intensity of his occupation. He had so much expression, as a rule, that people seldom thought about his features, but Callandar now noticed his long chin and the fine lines of his nostril. His pen scratched on for a few minutes, then he laid it down and turned round. "You have done me many kindnesses, Callandar," said he, "and now I am going to ask you for another, the greatest of all. It is everything to me that Captain Logie should get this letter. He is safe, I hope, over the water, but I do not know where. Will you take charge of it?" "I will," said the other. "Yes." The very name of Logie went against him. "You will have to keep it some little time, I fear," continued Archie, "but when the country has settled down you will be able to reach him through Lord Balnillo. Promise me that, if you can compass it, he shall get this. If it is to be done, I will do it." "From you, that is enough," said Flemington. "I shall rest quietly." He turned to his writing again. Callandar sat still, looking round the tent vaguely for something to distract his heavy thoughts. A card lay on the ground, and he picked it up. It was an ace, and the blank space of white round it was covered with drawing. His own consideration had procured pens and books, all that he could find to brighten the passing days for his prisoner. This was the result of some impulse that had taken Flemington's artistic fingers. It was a sketch of one of the sentries outside the tent door. The figure was given in a few lines, dark against the light, and the outline of the man's homely features had gained some quality of suggestiveness and distinction by its passage through Archie's mind and by the way he had placed the head against the clouded atmosphere made by the smoke rising from the camp. Through it came a touched-in vision of the horizon beyond the tents. He looked at it, seeing something of its cleverness, and tossed it aside. When Archie had ended his letter, he read it through. "When this comes to your hands, perhaps you will know what has become of me," he had written, "and you will understand the truth. I ask you to believe me, if only because these are the last words I shall ever write. A man speaks the truth when it is a matter of hours with him. You know what brought me to Balnillo, but you do not know what sent me from it. I went because I had no courage to stay. I was sent to find out how deep you were concerned in the Stuart cause, and to watch your doings. I followed you that night in the town, and my wrist bears the mark you set on it still. That morning I dispatched my confirmation of the government's suspicions about you. Then I met you, and we sat by the basin of Montrose. God knows I have never forgotten the story you told me. Logie, I went because I could not strike you again. You had been struck too hard in the past, and I could not do it. What I told you about myself was untrue, but you believed it, and would have helped me. How could I go on? Then, as I stood between the devil and the deep sea, my orders took me to the Venture, and we met again on Inchbrayock. I had made sure you would be on the hill. When I would have escaped from you, you held me back, and as we struggled, you knew me for what I was. You know the rest as well as I do, and you know where I was in the campaign that followed. Last of all, I was sent out with those who were to take you on the Muir of Pert. I had no choice but to go. The choice came at the crossroads below Huntly Hill. It was I who sent the warning to you from the little house on the Muir. You had directed me there for a different purpose. I sent no name with my message, knowing that if I did, you might suspect me of a trick to entrap you again. That is all. There remained only the consequences, and I shall be face to face with them tomorrow. There is one thing more to say. Do not let yourself suppose that I am paying for your life with mine. I might have escaped had I tried to do so. It was my fault that I did not try. I had had enough of untruth, and I could no longer take the king's money. I had served his cause ill, and I could only pay for it. I have known two true men in my life. you and the man who has promised that you shall receive this letter. If you will think of me without bitterness, remember that I should have been glad. Archibald Flemington. He folded the paper and rose, holding it out to Callandar. I am contented, said he. Go now, Callandar. You look worn out. I believe this last night is trying you more than it tries me. It was some little time after daybreak that Callandar stood again at the door of the tent under the kindling skies. Archie was waiting for him, and he came out. The eyes of the sentries never left them as they went away together, followed by the small armed guard that was at Callandar's heels. The two walked a little apart, and when they reached the outskirts of the camp, they came to a field, an insignificant rough enclosure in which half a dozen soldiers were gathered, waiting. At the sight of Callandar, the sergeant who was in charge of them began to form them in a line some paces from the wall. Callandar and Flemington stopped. The light had grown clear, and the smoke that was beginning to rise from the town thickened the air over the roofs that could be seen from where they stood. The daily needs and the daily avocations were beginning again for those below the hill, while they were ceasing for ever for him who stood above in the cool morning. In a few minutes the sun would get up. Already there was a sign of his coming in the eastward sky. The two men turned to each other. They had nothing more to say. They had settled every detail of this last act of their short companionship, so that there should be no hesitation, no mistake, nothing to be a lengthening of agony for one, nor an evil memory for the other. Archie held out his hand. "When I look at you," he said. "Yes," said Callandar. "There are no words, Callandar. Words are nothing, but the last bit of my life has been the better for you." For once speech came quickly to the soldier. "The rest of mine will be the better for you," he answered. "You said once that you were not a true man. You lied." Flemington was giving all to disprove the accusation of untruth, and it was one of the last things he was to hear. So, with these rough words, more precious to him than any that could have been spoken, sounding in his ears, he walked away and stood before the wall. The men were lined in front of him. His eyes roved for a moment over the slope of the country, the town roofs, the camp, then went to the distance. A solitary bird was crossing the sky, and his look followed it as it had followed the one he had seen when he made his choice at the foot of Huntly Hill. The first had flown away, a vanishing speck, towards the shadows gathering about the hills. This one was going into the sunrise. It was lost in the light. "Fire!" said Callandar, for Archie was looking at him with a smile. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Flemington. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nan Dodge. Flemington by Violet Jacob. Chapter 27. Epilogue. James Logie stood at the window of a house in a Dutch town. The pollarded beech, whose boughs were trimmed in a close screen before the walls, had shed its golden leaves, and the canal waters were grey under a cloudy sky. The long room was rather dark, and was growing darker. By the chair that he had left lay a yellow cur. He had been standing for some minutes reading a letter by the fading light, and his back was towards the man who had brought it. The latter stood watching him, stiff and tall, an object of suspicion to the dog. As he came to the end, the hand that held the paper went down to James's side. The silence in the room was unbroken for a space. When he turned, Callandar saw his powerful shoulders against the dusk, and the jealous shadows of the beech tree's mutilated arms. "I can never thank you enough for bringing me this," said Logie. "My debt to you is immeasurable." "I did it for him, not for you." Calendar spoke coldly, almost with antagonism. "I can understand that," said James. But something in his voice struck the other. Though he had moved as if to leave him, he stopped, and going over to the window, drew a playing card from a pocket in his long coat. "Look," he said, holding out the ace scrawled with the picture of the sentry. James took it, and as he looked at it his crooked lip was set stiffly, lest it should tremble. "It was in his tent when I went back there afterwards," said Calendar. He took the card back and put it in his pocket. "Then it was you," began James. "He was my prisoner, sir." James walked away again and stood at the window. Calendar waited, silent. "I must wish you a good day, Captain Logie," he said at last. "I have to leave Holland tonight." James followed him down the staircase, and they parted at the outer door. Calendar went away along the street, and James came back slowly up the steep stairs, his hand on the railing of the carved banisters. He could scarcely see his way. The yellow dog came to meet him when he entered his room, and as his master, still holding the letter, carried it again to the light, he followed. Halfway across the floor he turned to sniff at an old Kilmarnock bonnet that lay by the wainscot near the corner in which he slept. He put his nose against it, and then looked at Logie. Trust was in his eyes, and affection, but there was inquiry too. "My poor lad," said James. "We both remember." End of Epilogue. End of Flemington by Violet Jacob.